So, if you're listening right now, you probably think the biggest threats to your data privacy are, well, the famous big tech giants.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the dominant narrative, right?
Right. You know the ones. It's the usual suspects, like Facebook, Google, Amazon, or honestly, whatever social media app is currently tracking your scrolling habits while you're on the couch.
Yeah, we're completely conditioned to worry about the companies that serve us targeted ads. The ones constantly making headlines during congressional hearings.
Exactly. But I want you to consider a completely different scenario today. What if the companies that actually know the most about you, the ones actively building these massive predictive dossiers about your entire life, are these quiet, behind-the-scenes data cartels that you barely even notice?
Which is, frankly, a terrifying concept when you really dig into it.
It really is. Because these companies, they don't care about selling you sneakers. They sell your risk profile to the police.
And, the scope of their influence goes far, far beyond just surveillance. That is really what makes them so structurally significant to our society.
Right, and here's why this matters directly to you, the person listening right now. These exact same companies don't just package and sell your private, intimate data to law enforcement or, like, your landlord. They also control your access to public laws.
Yes, and scientific research.
Exactly. They control access to life-saving medical research. They manage the flow of vital financial news. I mean, they have essentially set themselves up as these unavoidable toll booths on the internet's entire circulatory system.
It's a comprehensive capture of both your private, personal life and our shared public knowledge. It's this dual threat business model, and it operates almost entirely in the shadows.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring the source material from the book Data Cartels, the companies that control and monopolize our information by Sarah Lambden.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. And over the course of this discussion, we are going to explore how former traditional publishers, specifically a company called RELX, which is the parent company of LexisNexis and Elsevier,
Right.
and Thomson Reuters, which is the parent of Westlaw.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to look at how they morphed into these massive data analytics empires.
Yeah, we'll be examining the underlying mechanics of how they dominate these completely disparate information markets. We'll look at the legal and technological loopholes they use to exploit both public knowledge and your personal privacy.
Right. And crucially, why the author argues that their unchecked bigness is fundamentally altering the architecture of our society.
Exactly.
So let's just unpack this from the very beginning, because when I first went through the sources, my initial reaction was just, pure confusion.
It's a lot to wrap your head around at first.
It is, because I remember names like LexisNexis and Westlaw from, legal thrillers I've read, or from seeing their logos on computer terminals in college libraries.
Yeah.
In my mind, they were just publishers.
Keep printing books, right?
Yeah. They printed heavy, physical stacks of legal reporters, hardcover statutes, academic journals. So how does a company that literally prints law books turn into a surveillance and data analytics empire?
Well, to understand that, we really have to look at the mechanics of traditional publishing before the internet, and, more importantly, what happened when digitization really began.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So for decades, companies like RELX and Thomson Reuters were, as you said, stockpiling physical information. If you were a lawyer in, say, 1985, you literally could not do your job without a physical library of case law.
Right, you needed the books.
Exactly. Thomson Reuters and RELX provided those books. But as computing power increased in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they began digitizing those massive archives.
Which makes total sense. I mean, everyone was moving to CD-ROMs and then the early web.
Yeah.
But, digitizing a book doesn't make you a data cartel. It just makes you a digital library.
And that is exactly where the pivot happened. They realized really early on that simply providing digital access to content was going to be a race to the bottom.
Because information on the internet wants to be free.
Or at least very cheap, yeah.
Yeah.
The leadership at these companies saw that the real long-term revenue wasn't in selling the content itself. The astronomical profits lay in building systems that could analyze that content.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They didn't just want to be the library anymore. They wanted to be the oracle.
Wait, hold on. Explain it. How do you go from a library to an oracle?
By transitioning from information retrieval to data analytics. They took the billions of records they already owned, so decades of court cases, financial reports, news stories, academic papers, and they began acquiring smaller, specialized databases to add to the pile.
Just hoarding as much data as possible.
Exactly. Then they developed proprietary algorithms to churn through it all. Instead of just handing a lawyer a digital stack of previous court cases, they started selling what they call risk solutions.
Risk solutions, that sounds so corporate.
It does, but what it means is they sell analytics that can predict, based on historical data, which specific legal arguments are most likely to win in front of a specific judge in a specific jurisdiction.
That fundamentally changes the product. I mean, they stopped selling the raw material and started selling the actual prediction.
Precisely, and that transition requires a very specific kind of operational machinery.
Which brings up this incredibly vivid analogy from the source material that I honestly just cannot get out of my head. The author compares the operations of these companies to a Play-Doh fun factory.
Yes, it's such a great way to visualize it.
You know, the little plastic toy where you shove dough in the top, press a big lever down, and it squeezes out a perfect star or a spaghetti noodle.
It illustrates the process of data structuring perfectly.
Right, because if you think about raw data out there in the real world, just random strings of names, addresses, court docket numbers, utility bill payments, it's like a big, amorphous, messy blob of gray Play-Doh.
Completely unstructured.
Yeah. To a human, or even a basic computer program, millions of disconnected records don't mean much at all. But these companies take that raw, unstructured data, they ingest it into their systems, shove it through their proprietary algorithm.
They're a fun factory.
Exactly. And they extrude it out the other side into a perfectly structured, highly predictive informational product. They turn the gray blob into a customized risk score that tells a bank if you are a fraud risk, or tells an insurance company exactly what they should charge you.
And the machinery of that Play-Doh fun factory is so incredibly expensive and complex to build that it creates this massive barrier to entry. And that really is where we get into the cartel behavior.
Okay, let's talk about the word cartel, because when we hear cartel, the cultural association is almost always illicit drugs.
Sure, yeah.
But cartels exist in legal open markets as well. The sources mention OPEC controlling the global price of oil.
Or consider the Federation of Quebec maple syrup producers.
Wait, really? A maple syrup cartel?
It is a literal government-sanctioned cartel in Canada, and they control a massive percentage of the global maple syrup supply. They dictate production quotas, they manage strategic reserves, and they set prices globally.
That is wild.
It is, but it proves the point. A cartel is simply an association of manufacturers or suppliers whose purpose is to maintain prices at a high level and restrict competition.
So how exactly are RELX and Thomson Reuters operating like the maple syrup cartel?
Yeah.
Because they aren't selling the exact same physical product, right? They're tech companies.
They operate like a cartel through their shared unified vision for the future of information markets and through their coordinated methods of market control.
Okay.
So while they might occasionally compete on the margins for, say, a specific university contract, they are essentially moving in lockstep to transition entire industries away from publishing and toward their analytics platforms.
Oh, I see.
The sources detail how they quietly buy up innovative startup competitors way before those startups can become genuine threats. They either integrate the startup's tech into their own fun factory, or they just kill it.
And it's not just buying up the competition either. The book highlights how they use non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, to basically keep their customers blind.
That is a classic market control tactic.
Yeah, like if you are a university library or a state government buying access to LexisNexis, you have to sign this strict NDA that prevents you from telling anyone else what you paid.
Right. And in a healthy competitive market, pricing is transparent. A buyer can shop around. But by forcing public institutions into these NDAs, the cartels ensure that, for example, the library at the University of Michigan has absolutely no idea what the library at UCLA is paying for the exact same database.
It totally shatters the negotiating power of the buyers.
Completely.
Yeah.
They share the market, they solidify their structural power, and they leave consumers and institutions with absolutely no alternatives.
Okay, I have to stop you there and push back on this entirely. Because as you describe this, the market control, the buying up of competitors, the secretive pricing, I'm sitting here listening and thinking, why on earth hasn't the government broken them up?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, we have mechanisms for this. Historically, the U.S. government broke up Standard Oil when it got too big. They broke up AT&T's telephone monopoly. If these data cartels are operating like giant octopuses, wrapping their tentacles around our foundational infrastructure, why are regulators just letting it happen?
Well, to answer that, we really have to look at a fundamental shift in the underlying philosophy of United States antitrust law. The legal framework we use to break up Standard Oil is simply not the framework we use today.
What changed?
So back in the early and mid-20th century, antitrust enforcement was heavily influenced by a structuralist approach.
Structuralist. Okay.
Right. The prevailing thought was that massive monopolies, regardless of how they operated day to day, were inherently dangerous. They were viewed as a threat to democracy, a threat to workers, and a threat to a healthy, competitive market structure.
So just the state of being too big was enough to trigger government intervention.
Essentially, yes. Power consolidation itself was the enemy. But starting in the 1970s, a movement known as the Chicago School of Economics, which was led by highly influential thinkers like Milton Friedman and Robert Burke, began to radically reshape legal thinking.
I've heard of Robert Bork.
Yeah, he wrote a profoundly influential book called The Antitrust Paradox.
And what was his argument? That monopolies are actually a good thing.
He argued that the old way of looking at monopolies was punishing efficiency. The Chicago School convinced lawmakers and judges that government intervention usually hurts the economy more than it helps it.
Interesting.
So they introduced this new legal standard called the Consumer Welfare Standard. Under this philosophy, the government should only punish a monopoly if that monopoly's behavior causes immediate, quantifiable economic harm to the consumer.
Wait, define consumer welfare in that context. What actually counts as harm?
Almost exclusively, it means higher prices at the cash register.
Seriously, just the price tag.
Pretty much. The courts adopted the view that if a massive corporate merger results in cheaper goods for the end user, or at least doesn't raise prices, then it is perfectly legal, regardless of how much market share the company controls or how many competitors it crushes.
Wow. So because RELX and Thomson Reuters are dealing in these complex, behind-the-scenes data analytics, mostly selling to massive institutions and government agencies rather than selling a physical widget to a consumer at a grocery store, they just fly completely under that old-school antitrust radar.
Exactly. The Consumer Welfare Standard fundamentally struggles to compute the harms of the digital age.
Because how do you quantify the price of lost privacy?
Exactly. How do you measure the economic harm to a consumer when a single company controls the algorithm that decides if they get bail? Because the traditional metric of antitrust law is just looking for a price hike on a consumer good, these data cartels have been able to consolidate immense power without triggering traditional regulatory alarms.
That is a staggering blind spot in our legal system, which means we really need to look at exactly what they are doing with all this unchecked power and, frankly, the human cost of it.
It's significant.
Because they've mastered turning our private lives into an open book for the government. And that brings us to the data brokers, or, as the sources chillingly refer to them, Big Brother's little helper. Let's dive into this institutional brokering, because it feels like the most direct threat to the average person listening today.
It is certainly the market with the most profound civil rights implications, without a doubt. Now, when the average person hears the term data broker, they usually think of commercial brokering.
Right. They think of the mechanisms that track their web clicks to serve them targeted advertisements.
Exactly. I search for a coffee grinder on Google, and suddenly my Instagram feed is just flooded with ads for coffee beans, which is annoying, sure, but not exactly life-threatening.
Right. Commercial brokering is about predicting purchasing behavior. But RELX and Thomson Reuters specialize in a much more consequential arena, institutional data brokering. Okay, what's the difference?
They aren't trying to sell you a product, they are selling you as the product. Specifically, they are selling your risk profile to the entities that hold power over your fundamental rights, your liberty, and your livelihood.
So we're talking about police departments, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, landlords deciding if you are worthy of an apartment, hospitals, employers doing background checks.
Yes, all of the above. The scale of the data they hold on everyday citizens is genuinely difficult to comprehend. And to understand how it got this pervasive, we really have to look at the history of how the specific technology was built. The sources detail a genuinely cinematic origin story involving a man named Hank Asher.
The Hank Asher story absolutely blew my mind because this wasn't some Stanford computer science prodigy tinkering in a garage. Asher was a former drug smuggler in the Caribbean who somehow transitioned into building databases.
His history is fascinating. So in the 1980s, Asher was flying illicit drugs from the Bahamas into the United States. He eventually got caught, cooperated with authorities, and managed to avoid serious prison time.
Okay.
But in the 1990s, he decided he wanted to use the wealth he had accumulated and his knowledge of how criminals operate to help law enforcement actually catch criminals. He became totally obsessed with data.
But how did he actually do it? Because the 90s were still, the early days of computing for this kind of massive tracking.
Asher effectively invented the modern concept of massive data fusion. Before Asher, if a detective in Miami wanted to find a suspect, they had to go physically pull paper records from the DMV.
Oh, wow.
Then they'd drive to the county courthouse to check property records, then literally call the utility company to see who was paying the electric bill at a specific address. It was incredibly slow, human-powered work. But Asher realized that all of these municipal and state agencies were slowly digitizing their records onto magnetic tapes.
So he just bought the tapes.
He bought everything he could get his hands on. Cheap, seemingly innocuous public records. Florida driver's licenses, real estate deeds, voter registrations, boat registrations. And then he wrote software algorithms designed to cross-reference all of those disparate databases at lightning speed.
That's genius. In a terrifying way.
He built a tool called AutoTrack, which he later evolved into a much more sophisticated system called Accurant.
He essentially digitized the paper trail of human existence.
Yes, and he made it searchable in milliseconds. A detective could type in a partial name in a vague location, and Asher's database would instantly fuse the DMV record, the property record, and the utility bill to spit out a web of associates, previous addresses, and vehicle ownership.
That's incredible.
His tools were so unprecedentedly fast and effective that police departments nationwide just quickly became completely dependent on them.
And this is exactly where the cartels step in, right? Asher builds the technology, proves the market is there, and then the massive corporations swoop in. The sources note that RELX eventually acquired the company that owned Accurant. And Thomson Reuters, seeing how incredibly lucrative this market was, acquired a competing data fusion product called Clear.
Today, those acquisitions form the absolute backbone of their institutional data brokering. Through Accurant, RELX maintains what they call Lexids. Thomson Reuters maintains Clear profiles. Between the two of them, they hold a comprehensive, constantly updating dossier on almost every single adult residing in the United States.
Let's break down the Lexid for a second, because it sounds so clinical, right, like a library card, but it is actually an incredibly invasive dossier. What exactly goes into the Play-Doh fun factory to create a Lexid?
The raw inputs are billions of unvetted data points swept up from both public and private sources. We are talking about every address you've ever lived at, your utility and cell phone payment histories, marriage and divorce records, professional licenses, DMV records, but they also pull from totally unregulated third-party sources. They scrape social media posts, they buy data from apps on your phone that track your geolocation, they track who you live with, predicting your network of family and associates.
They weave all that together to create a single, unique identifier, the Lexid, that basically follows you forever. But here is the thing that really stopped me in my tracks while reviewing the sources. The author argues that the creation of these massive private dossiers fundamentally bypasses the United States Constitution, specifically the Fourth Amendment.
This is perhaps the most critical legal mechanism at play here. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government.
Right.
Historically, this meant that if a police detective wanted to know every place you've lived for the last 10 years, every person you've associated with, and your entire financial history, they would need probable cause.
Right. They would have to go to a judge,
Yeah.
present actual evidence of a crime, and get a warrant to conduct that level of deep surveillance.
Exactly. But the Fourth Amendment only restricts the government. It does not restrict private corporations. RELX and Thomson Reuters are private entities. There is absolutely no constitutional barrier preventing them from collecting your utility bills and location data.
That is a massive loophole.
It is, and because of a legal concept called the third-party doctrine, which essentially states that you lose your expectation of privacy for information you voluntarily hand over to third parties, like phone companies or banks, these data brokers can vacuum up this information entirely legally.
So the private company builds the surveillance dossier legally, and then what? The government just buys it.
The government just buys a subscription.
Are you kidding me?
It is an extraordinary legal loophole. Federal agencies and local police departments can simply purchase access to the exact kind of comprehensive dragnet surveillance they are constitutionally prohibited from conducting themselves. They bypass the judge, the warrant, and the probable cause entirely just by writing a check to LexisNexis.
The scale of those checks is terrifying. The book details how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has used this to bypass sanctuary city laws. When a city refuses to share its local police data with federal immigration enforcement, ICE just buys the data from the cartels instead. The sources note that ICE pays LexisNexis almost $17 million and Thomson Reuters over $39 million to track immigrants using these dossiers. They use utility records, like literally someone turning on the electricity in a new apartment, to pinpoint their location for raids.
And the integration goes even deeper than government purchasing. RELX actually operates something called the Public Safety Data Exchange.
Yeah, I read about this. It sounds like an official government agency.
It is entirely private. It is a system where thousands of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies voluntarily pool their own police data arrest records, incident reports, field interviews onto RELX's private corporate servers.
Wait, why would police departments give their sensitive data to a private corporation?
Because RELX offers them access to the combined pool in return, it functions exactly like a massive national government fusion center. But because the servers are owned and operated by a private corporation, the entire database exists outside the reach of public transparency laws, like the Freedom of Information Act.
So the public has no right to audit how that data is being cross-referenced or who is accessing it.
None whatsoever.
I am really trying to wrap my head around the cultural shift here. Because when I was growing up in the 1980s, the big law enforcement push was McGruff the crime dog. Remember the commercials?
Oh,
A
vividly.
cartoon dog in a trench coat telling kids to take a bite out of crime. The whole ethos was about community watch.
Wow.
Looking out for your neighbors, keeping your eyes open, reporting suspicious activity to the local precinct. When I hear about thousands of agencies pooling data to spot crime, part of me wonders, is this just the modern digital version of McGruff the crime dog? Is it just a highly efficient, high-tech neighborhood watch?
It is very tempting to draw that parallel, as both relied on gathering information to prevent crime. But the mechanics and the resulting societal impacts are fundamentally different.
How so?
Well, the McGruff model, the neighborhood watch, relied on human intelligence. And human intelligence is inherently limited. A person looking out their living room window can only see one street. They have to sleep. Their memory fades.
A human can be wrong or biased, but their reach is small.
Exactly. A data analytics platform, however, relies on automated algorithms that see everything simultaneously, never sleep and never forget. But more importantly, we have to look at the quality of the data being fed into those algorithms. This is where the source material highlights the severe, life-altering flaws in the system. The data is not neutral. It amplifies systemic racism and existing societal biases.
Right, because if the raw Play-Doh going into the fun factory is contaminated, the risk profile coming out the other side is going to be contaminated.
Let's look at predictive policing. If historical policing practices have disproportionately targeted marginalized communities or specific neighborhoods, meaning more stops, more frisks, more arrests in those areas, then the raw data going into the database reflects that bias.
Okay, I call it.
When you feed that skewed data into an algorithm designed to predict where future crime will occur, the algorithm naturally points the police right back to those same marginalized neighborhoods.
It creates a self-fulfilling feedback loop. The algorithm sends cops to a neighborhood, the cops make arrests, those arrests are fed back into the algorithm, which then tells the cops to go back to the neighborhood again.
Precisely. And beyond the systemic bias, the data itself is frequently just mathematically inaccurate. The book points out the failure rates of facial recognition software when combined with these massive data dossiers. Under certain conditions, facial recognition can have a massive failure rate, sometimes cited as being wrong up to 96% of the time when misapplied or relying on poor source images.
Wait, 96%? How is it technologically possible for software that law enforcement actually relies on to be that spectacularly wrong?
It comes down to how the algorithms are trained and the quality of the inputs. Many of these facial recognition algorithms were trained primarily on datasets of white male faces.
Oh, I see.
Consequently, they struggle significantly to accurately distinguish between the features of people of color, particularly Black women. Furthermore, the source images police use, like blurry CCTV footage or low-light ATM cameras, are low quality. When you run a blurry photo of a Black man through an algorithm trained mostly on white faces and cross-reference it against millions of DMD photos in a Lexis database, the system will frequently generate a false match.
And that false match isn't just a computer glitch. It leads to armed police officers showing up at an innocent person's door. The book details horrific, real-world consequences, like the mistaken arrests of innocent Black men who were jailed purely because a flawed algorithm generated a false match, and the police trusted the machine over human investigation.
It's devastating, and we see similarly devastating errors in housing and employment. Landlords use tenant screening algorithms powered by this exact same cartel data. The algorithms scrape court records for eviction notices. But court records are notoriously messy. They often lack social security numbers, so the algorithm might simply match a name.
So if my name is John Smith and another John Smith in my city got evicted, the algorithm might attach his eviction to my Lexit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the landlord software just spits out a red deny flag. The prospective tenant is denied housing, and they often have absolutely no idea why.
And what is genuinely crazy about this is the complete lack of legal recourse. If a bank denies me a loan because my credit score is wrong, there is a federal law, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, that gives me the right to see my file, dispute the error, and force the credit bureau to fix it. I can call Equifax and make them correct the record. Can I do that with LexisNexis?
Yeah.
Can I call them up and say, hey, your algorithm says I'm a fraud risk because you confused me with another John Smith. Please delete my profile.
No, you generally cannot.
You're kidding.
Because these companies design their products as investigative tools or risk solutions rather than formal credit reports, they often operate in a gray area outside the strict consumer protections of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The data subject you has very little legal standing to demand transparency or correction.
So the errors just sit there.
The errors just sit in the database indefinitely. And because the system is constantly pulling in new data and running new predictions, it layers new mistakes on top of the old ones.
It is a terrifying reality. We have this deeply disturbing paradox. These companies are taking our absolute most private data, where we sleep, who we talk to, our financial struggles, our physical locations, and they are structuring it to make it completely visible to the government and to corporate gatekeepers.
Huh.
But there is a dark irony here.
Oh, very much so.
When we look at how they treat information that is actually supposed to be public, they do the exact opposite. They build a fortress. And that brings us to the second major pillar of their cartel behavior. The academic research oligopoly, dominated heavily by RELX's subsidiary, Elsevier.
This is where we see the flip side of their business model. With personal data, they make the private public. With scientific data, they make the public private.
That's a great way to put it.
Academic research is the foundational engine of human progress. It is how we discover cures for diseases, how we understand the mechanisms of climate change, how we develop new engineering techniques. Yet, a staggering 75% of all academic research is locked behind corporate paywalls.
And these paywalls are not cheap. The source material notes it costs around $30 just to read a single digital article.
And to clarify, paying that $30 usually doesn't even grant you ownership of a PDF. Often, it is essentially a temporary digital rental. You can view the article in your browser for a limited time.
I want to share this specific example from the sources because it illustrates the sheer absurdity of this system better than anything else. There was a scientist named Marion Bradford. Back in 1967, she published an article detailing a rapid and sensitive method for checking protein quantities in biological samples.
It is a foundational methodology, a highly practical, widely utilized piece of scientific literature that researchers use in laboratories all over the world.
Right. It has been cited almost 200,000 times by other scientists in their own work. It is legendary in its field. Today, decades later, if an independent researcher wants to read Marion Bradford's 1967 paper, Elsevier charges $35.95 for access. The filmmakers of a documentary investigating this estimated that this single decades-old article has generated millions of dollars in revenue for Elsevier. And guess how much the author, Marion Bradford, made from all those millions?
$0. The authors of academic papers are not paid royalties by the publishers.
Zero. And while it is easy to get mad about the money, the real tragedy is the human cost. The sources mention doctors working in Tanzania who are actively battling rampant, deadly malaria outbreaks. They're on the front lines of a public health crisis, but they literally cannot afford the $30 paywalls to access the latest life-saving research on the disease. They are artificially kept in the dark by a corporate profit margin.
Which demands that we examine the underlying mechanics of the academic publishing ecosystem. How did a private corporation gain the power to lock up medical research? It relies on an incredibly exploitative cycle, often referred to within academia as publish or perish.
Walk us through that cycle. How does a scientific discovery end up behind an Elsevier paywall?
Let's break down the life cycle of a scientific paper. Step 1, funding. The vast majority of scientific research in the United States and globally is funded by taxpayers through government grants, like those from the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation.
So the public has already paid for the research to happen.
Yes. Step 2, the labor. The scientists, often working at public universities, conduct the experiments, analyze the data, and write the article. Step 3, submission. The scientist submits the article to a prestigious journal owned by Elsevier. And crucially, the scientist signs away the copyright to the article.